Good morning. It's 9 o'clock. This is an Atticus Partners seminar. Thank you very much indeed for joining us. I appreciate that there'll be people both in the UK and around the world wanting to know what has happened with the spring statement that the Chancellor Rachel Reeves gave yesterday in the House of Commons, less than 24 hours ago. But there's been a reaction both at home and abroad, of course. We have a top panel for you this morning. We're just waiting for Dame Siobhan McDonagh to join us. When she does, I'll briefly say hello to her and then ask her to contribute. Dame Siobhan is a Labour Party politician. She's been the Member of Parliament for Mitcham and Morden since 1997. She served as an assistant whip under Gordon Brown between 2007 and 2008, and she's now on the Treasury Select Committee, one of its most vocal voices. Seamus Nevin is with us too. He's Chief Economist of Make UK, formerly EEF, and prior to joining EEF as it then was, Nevin was Head of Policy Research at the Institute of Directors. He served as a member of Chancellor George Osborne's National Living Wage Advisory Group and is currently co-founder and chair of the Irish and Westminster Network. You haven't invited me, Seamus, and an associate faculty member of the University of Oxford. Joe Twyman is with us as well. He's co-founder and director of Delta Poll, one of the most senior and experienced pollsters in the country. It is a public opinion consultancy, Delta Poll, and Joe was head of political and social research at YouGov. He served as a director since its creation in 2000. He's credited, quite rightly, for building YouGov's online research operation, and he teaches at many universities at home and abroad. We're very, very lucky to have such a great panel today, which of course includes Mike Buckley, who serves as senior counsel with Atticus Partners, as do I, it must be said. Mike has extensive political and policy experience spanning over 15 years. He's worked closely with Labour politicians such as Andy Burnham and David Miliband and much of the current cabinet as well. He's led campaigns, influenced national policy on fair pay, ending persistent personal debt, asylum rights, and other issues, as well as working with Atticus. He runs a think tank which looks at the UK-EU relationship and working with private sector leaders on both sides of the channel. It should be said that Joe and Mike are frequent guests on my own programs on Talk. I am a presenter there in fact, tomorrow between 4 and 7. If you want to join me, you're very welcome. And I am also an Atticus associate. So let's get started. What I'd like to do with this session is to get our panelists' perspective for about sort of 4 or 5 minutes each on the spring statement. I'll simply ask them, what do you think? We'll find out from them. We'll have a little bit of a discussion between ourselves. And then at about 9:30, what we're going to do is get your questions to them. So please send them in. I'm going to be sent them. If I'm looking down, please don't feel I'm distracted. I'm simply looking at my WhatsApp because that's how they're being sent through to me. The way to get them to Atticus is to comment in the comments section of this Zoom. So if you have any questions whatsoever on any topic, anything the panel are talking about, or you want them to talk about, please put your questions into the Q&A panel. I'm going to start with Seamus Nevin and ask him what your perspective on the spring statement is. Seamus, take it away.
Thanks, Peter, and good morning, everybody. I think in the context of the challenging and rapidly changing economic and political environment the Chancellor is facing, there's a very difficult balancing act, and she's in the unenviable situation of having to sort of rob Peter to pay Paul. So overall, yesterday wasn't a full fiscal event, and government were very clear to make that the case. They've committed to doing only one full budget a year. So trying to return to a more stable policy environment for businesses. So industry will welcome the support and the Chancellor's focus on maintaining that stability in the economy, and indeed the increases in infrastructure and defence investment. It's clear that the Chancellor will need to continue to make difficult spending choices amid the likelihood that investment in defence and security will have to rise further given the scale of the threats that we now face. And of course, Labour's new mantra seems to be that the world has changed, and that is definitely the case when you look at the context of what has gone on in Russia, but also the other changes that are taking place around the world with the rise of China and the tariff threats that have come in from the US and other factors as well. So UK manufacturers, I think, will stand ready to support the government in that mission to scale up defence manufacturing as a critical national priority, not least because of the spillover benefits that it will have across the wider industry. there are 18,000 manufacturers that feed into the UK defence supply chain, not all of which are primarily or even very considerably in the defence supply chain, but they will all benefit in some way from increased defence spending, whether that be simply in raw inputs like nuts and bolts or paints or whatever. But the supply chain is quite broad and quite wide, so it'll affect a lot of companies in that sense, and could be a significant means of shifting the dial when it comes to the industrial strategy domestically in the UK. Looking ahead, though, I think all eyes will be on government bringing forward a comprehensive and fully funded, modern and long-term industrial strategy. They've made a lot of noise about this when in opposition and during the election campaign. And of course, the rubber now needs to hit the road, and there is a certain amount of leeway and time that it takes any new government when they come into office and take power to get settled and get their head across the spreadsheets and understand the details behind the scenes before they can make the significant public announcements that are expected. But it's quite clear that an industrial strategy is going to be at the heart of Labour's economic agenda. And I think that's something that is very welcome, because when you look at what's happening in other countries around the world, the UK has for a long time been one of the few major economies that hasn't really had a long-term industrial strategy from its government. So that sort of certainty and stability coming off the back of the last decade or so of a lot of turbulence and chop and change around the geopolitical position and around the global economy will be, again, very welcome. But indeed, that must be aligned across a number of different aspects. The defence strategy and the industrial strategy obviously need to be aligned. Our trade strategy will need to be fed into that and incorporated into that as well, because there's no point in trying to agree trade deals overseas if those trade deals undercut the plans that are being made domestically. The civil service reforms that are taking place, I think, are designed to try and aid that process. There's a lot of talk about mission boards and cross-government working. And indeed, Labour's 5 missions require the different government departments that have not always necessarily worked effectively together in the past to be much more aligned. And the machinery of government, the changes that are being made behind the scenes, will be very, very important in that regard. But this is all qualified by the economic context, and the OBR's analysis that fed into the Spring Statement yesterday. I think there are some positive aspects of that in terms of the growth that they are calculating over the course of this parliamentary term. But there are also some worrying headwinds as well. I mean, the fact that productivity has been revised downwards over the next 5 years is a concern, because ultimately productivity growth is where economic growth comes from. That's where living standards improvements come from. And it's really important that we get that right. So the drive to automation and digitalization, which the government are very, very keen on, will be vitally important. And the big spanner in the works came after the Spring Statement late last night, when Donald Trump in the US announced the intention to bring in 25% tariffs on all automotive imports into the US. The impact of that could be quite considerable for the UK. The OBR did make forecasts and predictions on versus hypothetical scenarios of what the implications of that might be. And the worst case scenario they suggested of unilateral tariffs coming one way from the US on UK goods would be that it would reduce GDP growth by about 1%. If we retaliate, there's other implications for that too. But one thing that they didn't assess in that forecast, and I think will be important to consider and will be a worry for many businesses in the UK. And Peter, I'm sure you're acutely aware of this, is that Northern Ireland has a different position within the United Kingdom when it comes to tariffs and trade, because it is still part of the EU's remit for tariffs. So whether the EU decides to retaliate against the US with its own tariffs will have implications for Northern Ireland, and therefore for the domestic supply chain in the UK too. So it's a very complicated picture. And there are a lot of moving parts.
Can I just ask you to make just a final point, Seamus, if that's okay?
And that's me.
Oh, wonderful. Okay, perfect timing. Let's go to Joe Twyman now, because I want to get in fact, Siobhan McDonough, Joe, apologies. I'll bring in Siobhan McDonough so we're not a manel, so that we hear from Siobhan, a long-serving politician and also the only woman on the panel. Siobhan, thank you for joining us. I've introduced you and given your credentials already so far. As a member of the Treasury Select Committee, can you just give us maybe sort of 3 or 4 minutes on your take on yesterday's Spring Statement? Then I come to Joe.
Well, I think it's pointless not to accept that these are difficult times. I mean, this morning's announcement from President Trump indicates what a unusual and volatile environment that we're living in. I think Rachel, as Chancellor, did the very best she could in the circumstances in which she found herself. I was delighted to see that uh, that our government's decisions to make more flexible the planning process, building more houses, is going to have a positive effect on the economy. Certainly going to help very many people in my constituency, and that sign of improvement doesn't include the bill that we started this week on planning, which is the more radical of the measures we propose, because they can't consider a law until it actually becomes a law. So there may be more good news there in the future. I think for Labour, the changes in the benefit system are tough. None of us want to do some of the things that we are probably going to have to do. I have some sympathy with the Chancellor's comments that she doesn't believe the figures about how many people will be thrown into poverty, because it doesn't look at the fact that, you know, if we can encourage more people into work and from benefits, there's a benefit to themselves, there's a benefit to the exchequer and to the taxpayers currently paying to support the amount of people who are currently on incapacity benefits. We still see 1,000 successful PIP applications a day. We have 1 in 10 people of working age on incapacity benefit, and 1 in 8 of young people not in work or training or studies of any sort. So these are very tough times, but sometimes, you know, necessity is the mother of inventions, and that, you know, we do have a welfare system that does need changing. And maybe if we weren't in these dire situation, we wouldn't be looking at that. But, you know, we are failing an awful lot of people, and we're generally failing the British taxpayer at the moment with the system that we have. So my view is she did the very best she could in the circumstances she found herself. She's absolutely determined to drive growth, and she has my total support and commitment for that.
How comfortable is the Labour Party to be in at the moment? There must be, as you say, a lot of people having all sorts of questions and worrying about how the public will take this. We'll talk about that with Joe Twyman in a second, but I wonder from your perspective as a Labour MP, how comfortable is it at the moment?
It's not comfortable, because you know, we are the, you know, we see ourselves anyway as the you know, as the strongest supporters of the welfare system, but sometimes we need to ask ourselves, we can also be slightly conservative, I may say, in wanting systems to remain the same, and that change is difficult, particularly if it to find harder times. So, and if you think about how many of our MPs are new, so they've only been in the job 8 months, they're being asked to do things that challenge them, their views and values. So it is quite a hard time. But, you know, that's the price of government, isn't it? You know, no moaning there.
To govern is to choose, certainly. Yeah,
yeah,
Siobhan.
and we take our line from the Chancellor. I was amazed to see actually in the Times today, or might even a bit, sorry, might have been the Telegraph, her described as the glass half full Chancellor, given that she got a lot of flack for being too downbeat at the very start of her being Chancellor.
James Siobhan, thank you. Let's go to Joe Twyman of Delta Poll. Joe, obviously it's too early to know what the public thinks through polling, but given the broad trends in regard to Labour's economic record, and I'm sure there'll be some polls out at the weekend, perhaps even you and your minions are beavering away at the moment on those. Tell us what you think and what you think the public is going to make of the spring statement. You're just on mute at the moment, by the way, Joe.
Okay, how's that?
Loud and clear.
Hopefully you can hear me good. I think it's really important to look at this context, as you say, and look at this event in the context of public opinion, but not just in terms of British public opinion, but actually in terms of the global public opinion. And what do I mean by that? Well, in the last year, we had elections in more than 60 countries. First time anything like that has happened before, and in the vast majority of those elections, in more than 8 out of 10, the incumbent government lost, and in all but one, at least one that I've found, the incumbent government lost its vote share, so its vote share reduced. Now, the reasons for that were, of course, very complicated and varied from country to country, but one of the common themes was to do with inflation and the pernicious effect that inflation has on public opinion. You see, as prices rise, people notice it, they feel it in their pocket, whether they're rich or poor or somewhere in between. They feel that rise. We had a lot of mention during the American elections about the price of eggs, for instance, and people can focus on specific prices or prices generally, but they feel it. The difficulty that governments have is that they can turn around and say, we are controlling inflation, and that may be true. That was a line that Rishi Sunak put forward. That was a line that Joe Biden put forward, along with many others. The difficulty is controlling inflation means, as we know, that prices simply stop rising as much as they have done previously. It doesn't mean that prices go down. It doesn't mean that energy bills fall. It doesn't mean that the price of eggs is reduced. And that was very damaging for lots of incumbent governments last year. And now we're reaching a stage where I think we're in this sort of strange post-incumbency throw-out period. And so we've had a lot of incumbent governments thrown out. They've been replaced by new governments, and those new governments face many of the same challenges, and that is a problem that they're all suffering from. And so the Labour government, in this instance, has inherited a difficult situation from the previous Conservative government. But in the view of many of the public, the situation has not changed substantially. There will be very few people who will be going to look through all of the details of the spring statement. In fact, the average person in the street and the 50% of people less engaged than the average person in the street probably won't be paying much attention to it at all. Instead, in terms of economic policy, they're interested in the broad narratives. Are these changes going to be effective? Are they the right decisions to make? And are they being done fairly? These broad stories that we tell ourselves and each other inform the public's general view about the economy. And that will be interesting to see whether it changes over the next few days, months, weeks and months. Up until now, basically things have remained where they were since the last government in terms of people's economic expectations. And when you ask the public which party is best to deal with the economy out of the Conservatives and Labour, it's effectively been neck and neck now for a few weeks, if not months. And that story is replicated in general voting intention. We see and have seen now for many weeks effectively a three-way tie between the Conservatives, Labour and Reform UK, with the Lib Dems managing to gain ground as well. And so we're in uncharted territories in many ways when it comes to public opinion. But it's the long-term trends that are most important. And so the government, I'm sure, will be hoping that the effect of this announcement and the cumulative effect of economic policies that are announced over the next few months will bring about a change in people's perceptions. But given what has gone before, I think that is quite a challenge ahead.
Is it too simple, Joe, to simply say that voters will be asked in 2029, do you feel better off or worse off under Labour, and they'll give the verdict? I mean, is that too simple? I know there are a number of different aspects that drive voting behaviour, but is that the number one?
That's an absolute measure. In other words, how is Labour doing in absolute terms? And while that's important, the more important question is the relative question. The question of yes, Labour you might not be feeling better under Labour, but do you think Labour will do a better job than the Conservatives or Reform UK or the Liberal Democrats? Now, Liberal Democrats and Reform UK don't really have an economic platform and an economic policy in the same way that the two main parties do, at least not yet. But I think the next election will come down to whether people believe that that Labour can, have, and will do a better job than the Conservatives. At the moment, it remains uncertain. But the damage that was done to the Conservatives' reputation for economic policy over the last Parliament will take some undoing. The question is whether Labour will do enough, or whether they'll let essentially another party in, because people are essentially so frustrated, for want of a better expression, with the two traditional main parties.
Joe, thank you. Let's go to Mike Buckley. Mike, perhaps you could give us your perspective and maybe let us into your thinking about what effect these tough choices will have on the Parliamentary Labour Party, and support for Keir Starmer within that as well, perhaps at some point in your answer.
Well, I mean, the first thing to say on that is I think there's still huge support for Keir Starmer and indeed for Rachel Reeves within the Parliamentary Labour Party, within the party more broadly. People want this government to succeed and want to do everything they can to ensure that this government does succeed, both in terms of getting re-elected in 2028 or 2029. But in the meantime, more importantly, bringing about the change that we all want to see in our society, making it a fairer place, making growth happen, helping us take action on things like climate change and European security, and increasing, respect for Britain's role in the world and all of those things. So there's still huge goodwill for that, and I don't think that's going to change in the short, medium, or long term. People have come into this government because they want this government and this country indeed to succeed. But nonetheless, you would have seen in the papers overnight and this morning, there is disquiet in the Parliamentary Labour Party and disquiet in the Labour Party more broadly about some of the decisions that Rachel Reeves and the government have made in this spring statement, and then more broadly when you look at things like welfare cuts, for example. And it is as many people have pointed out, it is the case that Rachel Reeves had three choices given the pressure on public finances. She could have cut welfare, put taxes up, or increase borrowing. And of those three choices, she's chosen to cut welfare. That is, of course, going to be most difficult for the people and the households affected. But it is also difficult for lots of Labour Party people who have come into politics, in part driven by the desire to help people at the bottom of the pile, to reduce inequality, and particularly to help people who are vulnerable and have no other means of income because they're elderly or because they're people of ill health. But I think it is also, to give Rachel Reeves some credit, just worth recognising just what a difficult position that she is in. I mean, we spoke a lot last year about the fact that she received a terrible economic inheritance from the Conservative Party, but she did. I mean, our debt is about 100% of GDP. That is huge, far bigger than many, many other Western nations. Public services are in a worse position than they were when John Major left government in 1997. The Labour government needs to take action to fix those. Obviously, primarily, first and foremost, the NHS, but all the other public services as well. Things like youth clubs and education, and local government, and all of these things that make a big difference to our lives and to our sense of well-being and to our sense of, is any change happening in our society? Labour needs to be taking action on all of those fronts as well, combined, of course, with a very, very difficult geopolitical context. And I think we knew it was difficult when they came into power last summer, because the war was already, well underway in Ukraine, and things were very bad in the Middle East, as they are now. But I don't think anybody expected, even with Trump coming into power, that the change there and the very clear signals that they are sending now about withdrawing the guarantee of US defense support from not just from Ukraine, but from Europe as well, which is a process that is in play. Of course, the government has to respond to that. We all have to respond to that as European nations. That, of course, is going to add huge extra pressure on government finances, and something has to give. So I think what Rachel decided, we'll see how it plays out, I think, in terms of living standards, because, of course, what she's saying is different to what, say, Joseph Rowntree Foundation or Resolution Foundation are saying. So that is going to play out in coming months and years. But for now, Rachel has, I think, made the best choices that she was able to make.
Mike, thank you for that, and thanks to all the panelists for giving their initial thoughts. Just a reminder, you can send in your questions in the comment box. We've received some already, and I have my own thoughts as well in regard to what I want to ask the panel. But listen, thank you for your opening thoughts there, Dame Siobhan McDonagh, Mike Buckley, Seamus Nevin, and Joe Twyman. I'm going to take a question from the audience now, and the first one is, has the Labour Party lost its core values in respect to cuts in welfare? Siobhan McDonagh.
No, as you'd expect me to say. No, I think you do have to ask the question, do you really want a young person to proceed from school and education into incapacity benefit? And in part, that's what we've got going on. So it is our responsibility to ensure that we tackle that as a social problem. We also know that benefits are never going to be a way that families can thrive and do well. So, you know, the clue is in the title. We are the Labour Party. We fundamentally believe in work. So it's very important that we structure benefit welfare systems that encourage work and help people to get into work. As you all know, there is about £1.2 billion set aside in order to improve the support and the help that people get in order to help them get into work once they are on benefits and they are on incapacity benefit. It also, we have to be careful with other people's money. You know, the government doesn't have any money, it has taxpayers' money, and some of them are not on much more than people on benefits get. And so we have to make sure that we spend their money with all seriousness. And people applying for incapacity since during and since lockdown haven't had their claims looked at or reassessed. So actually, what we're watching is the culmination of the collapse of the welfare benefit system on incapacity. So it is very much our job to look and make sure that that money is being spent on the right people. So that is very Labour.
Thank you, Siobhan. Mike Buckley, another Labour Party expert. Do you, just to go back to the question, has the Labour Party lost its core values in respect to cuts on welfare?
No, I don't think it has, but I think it's completely understandable that many people in the Labour Party, a number of MPs, as I said earlier, have spoken out. The TUC, the Trade Union Congress, spoke out, and obviously not Labour Party, but certainly concerned about similar issues. Organisations like Joseph Rowntree Foundation and Resolution Foundation have spoken out about the impact of cuts, and indeed have been asking the same question, you know, making the point that based on their calculations, this is going to make people poor and push people into poverty. And they themselves are asking the question, is this what a Labour government should do? I think we'll have to see how it plays out over time. Rachel Reeves is saying this is going to push people into work, not into poverty. If that is proven to be true a year or two from now, then everybody will be, you know, respecting the decisions that Rachel Reeves has made. If it is doing the opposite and pushing people into poverty, then the policy may to be reconsidered. But there is a wider point here, and that is that since the pandemic, I mean, in the pandemic, of course, all nations, all Western nations saw the numbers of the proportion of the population on welfare and receiving benefits go up because of the impact the pandemic had. In the vast majority of nations, that's normalized and gone back to pre-pandemic levels. The UK is very much an outlier in seeing those figures stay up. So we do have a wider problem in our society of the fact that for some reason, people are staying on benefits rather than going back into work, education, or training. That does need to be addressed. I think this is part of the government seeking to address that. This is perhaps a bit more of a stick than a carrot in terms of making that happen. But nonetheless, I think there needs to be wider attention put in and wider policy changes put in place across government to make sure that we get people who can work off benefits and into work, which is better for them, better for society as a whole. But I think Labour will also always make sure that there is a floor in place and you know, support in place for people who genuinely cannot go into work, educational training.
Seamus, I'm not perhaps going to ask you to comment, unless you want to do so, about the core values of the Labour Party, but in a broader economic context, I just wonder what your thoughts are in regard to the cuts in welfare specifically and what effect that will have economically.
Um, so I can't really speak to the welfare cuts in particular, but what I would say is that from my engagement, speaking on behalf of businesses with government ministers and with government officials, I think obviously this was a very, very difficult decision that the Labour Party had to make given the economic context. But it also should be taken in the round. This is the first step of a very significant reform that is being made to the labour market. There are other reforms coming down the line, most important, I think, of which will be around the apprenticeship levy, which Labour are planning on turning into a growth and skills levy. The skills gap is the biggest, to my mind, barrier to economic growth in the UK. I say that not only because of the size of it. There are 55,000 unfilled vacancies in the manufacturing sector alone. It's costing about £6 billion a year in terms of lost revenue opportunities for the UK. So quite a considerable chunk of money. But it's also something that can be controlled. And the reforms that we are engaging with government to encourage will, I think, have a significant impact on the skills in the workforce and on boosting productivity. And that productivity point, to come back to what I mentioned earlier, is the only way that we are going to grow the economy, but it's also how living standards will increase in future. If we can get productivity growing again, you will see increased wages across the board. You will see increased living standards. You will also see increased tax revenues for the exchequer, and therefore greater opportunity to invest in the welfare state, in infrastructure, in all of the other things that improve living standards and make Britain a world-leading economy. So I wouldn't take the welfare cuts in and of themselves. I would try, where possible, to look at all of the other aspects that are going to come alongside this going forward, and then assess the labour market in the round and the impact that will have on the economy as a whole.
Thank you, Seamus. Joe, does the public care about Labour's core values? It's a battle for Labour to fight. Perhaps if it is indeed a battle, I think Siobhan and Mike might disagree with that. But does the public really care what Labour stands for? Surely they care what the outcomes are.
Well, they care about things like effectiveness, competency, ability to deliver, and they care about fairness. These broad narratives that we discussed. But at the same time, when it comes to welfare, there is a recognition that reform needs to take place. Depending on how you ask the question, between 2/3 and 3/4 of people believe that the welfare state needs significant reform, but there's then very little agreement on exactly how that reform should take place. And so it is a difficult challenge, not just for the Labour government, but for successive governments of all colours, that they're faced with this situation. There is a recognition and an understanding that welfare needs to be reformed. But reforming welfare is extremely difficult to do in a way that firstly can be effective, secondly can make a difference, and thirdly, and perhaps most importantly, can be perceived to be making a difference. Because the general public has very little understanding of the amount of money that's spent on welfare, both as a proportion of total government spending, but also in absolute terms. And then within welfare spending, they have a very little understanding of where it is spent and how. So it gets very complicated very quickly.
Joe, thank you. Let's go to another question, and that is, why did the Chancellor not mention SMEs, small and medium-sized businesses, yesterday? Do you think it's because it's a vulnerable area for the government? We know, of course, on Tuesday, SMEs and many other businesses are going to be affected by the changes to national insurance. Seamus, maybe I'll start with you, and then I'll go to Siobhan McDonough. Seamus, perhaps you can give us your perspective on this.
Yeah, it's a very good question. I mean, she did mention SMEs in the context of defence specifically, in talking about opening up the defence supply chain for the MOD to SME manufacturers, because historically the MOD has largely almost exclusively dealt with the big primes and not with those smaller and startup companies that maybe are the place where innovation and future development can come from. But that's a very specific sector. In terms of the wider SME community, yeah, I think a lot of them will feel concerned that they don't seem to be at the forefront of the Chancellor's mind, not least because the impact of the autumn statement has been very, very considerable on that tranche of smaller and family-owned businesses with the changes to national insurance, employers' national insurance. We reckon the increase per employee is about £1,000 per year in extra tax. So that's a considerable impact for a small company. And then you get into the inheritance tax changes, which I think are a big concern for all of those family-owned companies who, again, tend to be on the smaller side of things. And the UK has a disproportionately large number of family-owned businesses relative to other economies. So there will need to be positive announcements going forward. But I think coming back to the point that the Chancellor has been keen to stress, that she wants to have one fiscal event a year, those are much more likely in the autumn statement, in the autumn budget, after the comprehensive spending review is completed in the summer. This was never going to be that budget, despite some of the lines of attack that came from the Conservative Party. Yesterday was a spring statement. It was a much more of a return to a conventional spring statement. It was never meant to be a mini budget. Those big fiscal decisions will come later in the year.
Okay, Seamus, thank you. Siobhan McDonagh, just a reminder of the question. Why did the Chancellor not mention SMEs yesterday? Do you think this is because it is a vulnerable area for the government?
I think that the Chancellor, nearly everything she does in her growth agenda is about small and medium-sized enterprises, because we know that's where the growth is going to come in the economy. So on house building and freeing up the planning system, that really involves the SME construction sector, because we want to break up the big monoliths house builders. We don't want them to have all the action themselves. We do know that we've had a decline in the number of houses built because SMEs have been squeezed out, because our planning process is so long and laborious and difficult. When it came to her comments on the defence industry, I think she quoted the Small Business Federation as being in support of many of the moves to encourage the development of manufacture in the UK for the defence industry. So I certainly don't think SMEs were forgotten. I think they were centre stage, but it was a spring statement. It wasn't a budget. That wasn't the purpose.
Siobhan, thank you. Perhaps I can go to Joe Twyman about SMEs. What do you make of this aspect of things, Joe? You're just on mute, Joe, again. Joe, you're just on mute there.
So I don't know what's going on there. It's often said that
it's 2021.
It's often said that small businesses are the backbone of the economy. It's almost a cliche to hear politicians say that, but it's very important because so many people in the country are employed by SMEs and run SMEs, and so what happens to SMEs has a big impact on the perception that people have of the economy. And indeed, one of the criticisms, either implicitly or explicitly, that people have of the way that that the government thinks about the economy is in terms of GDP and growth, which so often effectively measures the strength of the economy based on the largest companies in the country and the wealthiest people in society. Whereas SMEs, the things that we, as I say, that so many people come into contact with, work with, run, those are the kind of things that have a big impact day to day on people's perceptions of the economy. And so SMEs are extremely important. The fact that they weren't mentioned yesterday, I don't think will have a big impact on things either way. As I said earlier, most people aren't paying close attention to the detail on this. But I think in terms of the government priorities, it has to be up there if the government is to effectively change perception in a lasting fashion.
Finally, Mike, your thoughts on this?
I mean, I've engaged with SME leaders a lot over the last few years because of the work I've been doing on the impact of the UK's departure from the European Union, and talking to SME leaders and to sector bodies like the FSB, Federation of Small Businesses, about what they want to see in changed relationship between the UK and the EU that would enable them to export more and to collaborate more with partners in Europe and so on. So through that, I hear a lot of their concerns about politics more generally, their view of what the government is doing. And it is the case that a lot of people, and indeed some of the sector bodies as well, would argue that SMEs, small and medium enterprises, are often overlooked by government. They don't feel they get a huge amount of attention from from government, actually, of any political party. They do want more attention paid to them. They recognise there are, of course, huge numbers of them, and there isn't an obvious person to go to. Whereas if you're going to talk to BMW or one of the other big manufacturers or one of the other big companies in the country, you know who to pick up the phone and talk to. Whereas in the SME sector, the same is not true. However, the sector does employ huge numbers of people in the country, contribute a huge amount to GDP, serve the interests of the whole economy, and as many of them will remind me on a regular basis, if you don't have a small or medium enterprise, you never end up with a big one. So the sector really does need time and attention from policymakers. Now, I firmly believe that the government we have now, the Labour government, is putting the time and energy into making that happen through Johnny Reynolds and the Department of Business and Trade. And various other different departments as well. I don't think that has yet fed through into huge changes in policy, but I believe that it will in the future. And I'm sure that will have some impact on the choices that Rachel Reeves makes, in the next budget and the budget after that, because I do think there's a commitment from government to pay attention to the sector and to serve its needs. And I think we'll see that in the reset with the EU as well, when we get to the summit there on the 19th of May, which is going to be held in London, and then subsequent negotiations. I do believe that attention will be paid to the needs of small and medium enterprises as well. But I can understand maybe on the back of yesterday's spring statement, the sector thinking, well, what about us? But I think that goes back to the comments that have already been made. Well, this wasn't a budget. When we get to the budget, then you will see your needs attended to.
Mike, thanks for that. And thanks for clarifying the FSB you're engaging with is the Federation of Small Businesses rather than the other one. There's a question for Joe Twyman here specifically. Joe, you mentioned that in 2029, the electorate would consider if Labour had done a good job, or then if not, vote Conservative. Is reform a significant threat to Labour? And how might it shape Rachel Reeves's policies or her replacement if she is replaced during this Parliament, says this question.
Well, that's essentially the most important question of the next 4 years, the degree to which reform is a risk, not just to Labour, but to Conservatives as well. Up until this point, if you were simplifying things, you would say that reform has mainly drawn people from the Conservative Party. But in more recent polls, it appears that it's now an equal match between the number of people who voted Conservative at the last election and the number of people who voted Labour. Now, of course, it's worth pointing out that the number of people who voted Labour at the last election was higher than the number of people who voted Conservative. But there's no doubt that in certain areas of the country, among certain demographic groups, reform is attractive to those voters. But the really important question is, can reform translate performance in polls to performance at the ballot box? Because in the past, that has been at times quite a difficult thing for them to manage. Not, of course, in second-order elections such as European elections, where we've seen the Brexit Party and UKIP triumph. But in general elections, where, if you like, it really matters. I think a good indication of that will be the upcoming local elections in May, because reform will hope to make big gains there. But I imagine that actually it will be the Liberal Democrats who will perhaps be the greater beneficiaries of those elections, simply because they have much greater experience of the ground game, of actually getting candidates together, getting them all signed up and getting them out there campaigning. We saw at the last election the difficulty that Reform UK had simply finding 650 candidates that passed the in inverted commas vetting system that Reform had in place. It will be interesting to see how many of the 1,000 or more candidates that are required for the local elections will be found in time, and how many will cause problems. So there's the operational difficulty, but there's if you like the party difficulty. As a party of protest, as a party of that focuses at least so far mainly on immigration, that leap to a more rounded party with a well understood and well-known economic policy, for instance, that's a step that Reform has not yet made. The question is, as I say, over the next 4 years, will they actually be able to solve those problems, those operational problems, and at the same time be able to present themselves as having credible, well understood well-known policies on the economy, but also on health, education, etc., their answer can't simply be fewer immigrants to all of those questions, because that won't be enough to get them over the line.
Joe, thank you for that fascinating perspective. I remember Nigel Farage at one point saying that Reform UK needed to learn many lessons from the Liberal Democrats in terms of their ground game in regard to the local elections, which is not something you necessarily would expect to hear from him. Let's talk about growth now. We haven't really mentioned growth, and we have a question from someone. And just to point out, you still can send in your questions in the comments box here on the Zoom, and we will ask them between now and 10 o'clock. We're about 3/4 of the way through. So let's ask a question on growth. Would a bespoke US economic deal help UK growth? And has Keir Starmer been using the advantages of Brexit? Let's start with Seamus Nevin.
That's a good question. I think it would depend on what was in the deal. There's been a lot of talk over recent years about wanting more trade deals, but actually the quality of those trade deals is really what matters to business. And being realistic, there is only a certain amount of growth that can come from trade deals, not least because the kind of economic growth barriers that are affecting the UK economy are, in many cases, are domestic driven. I mentioned about skills. The tax regime is obviously an important one as well. And indeed, the fact that the bulk of our trade is still with the European Union or member states of the European Union is another aspect of this that needs to be considered. So there's a lot of changes going on right now domestically to try and address those, and I think that they will all be part of that picture. The other side of this is the technological changes that are taking place. Labour have made a big point of wanting the UK to become an AI superpower, to be one of the leading economies when it comes to the adoption of digitalized and automated technologies. And I think that will be vitally important as well. We are the 6th largest economy in the world, but we are the 25th when it comes to adoption of these technologies. We lag way behind our international competitors. And that's largely a result of an underinvestment from the business community. 50% of research and development spend in the UK comes from the manufacturing sector, so it punches above its weight relative to the other sectors in the UK economy. But overall, business investment in the UK tends to be at the bottom end of the OECD league table and has been for quite some time. So these domestic factors, I think, will have a much more considerable impact on growth going forward. But of course, a comprehensive trade deal with a major economy like the US, with an economy that we have a lot in common with, both culturally, legally, economically, all the rest of it, would be very, very valuable. Tariffs are the other big side of this, and whether the US is interested in a comprehensive trade deal of the kind that would be beneficial to us is another question, but that's for the politicians to decide. And I'm thankfully an economist and not somebody who needs to engage in these sorts of conversations.
Well, let's ask one of the politicians, Siobhan McDonagh, the question just to remind ourselves: would a bespoke US economic deal help UK growth? And has Keir Starmer been using the advantages of Brexit, Siobhan?
I think that Keir Starmer, in as far as he could, has done the very best that he can with the relationship with President Trump and with America. In fact, I think that my view is fairly much shared across the electorate as well. The problem you're dealing with is the unpredictability of President Trump's government and what they want to see. Clearly, Keir Starmer will be pushing every advantage that he has, it appears, including the King, in order to encourage support from President Trump. The announcement this morning about the tariffs on cars, I think, was anticipated but disappointing. So we are just in uncharted territory.
Mike, I'm sure you agree we're in uncharted territory. What's your perspective on this one?
We are in uncharted territory, but nonetheless, I mean, even before Trump came in, there were things that held true vis-a-vis the desirability or the likelihood of a US trade deal. I mean, Trump was in power for 4 years and didn't do anything about putting a trade deal in place with the UK. Then Biden was in place, didn't do anything about putting a trade deal in place with the UK. I'm not sure that the US in all of that time has put a new trade in place with everybody. I think maybe the agreement they have with Mexico and Canada is It's relatively recent. But other than that, they don't seem very interested in trade deals at all. And certainly Donald Trump hasn't shown any interest in trade deals with anybody, never mind the UK. I think he occasionally mentions it, but never does anything about it. The other big problem, of course, with the US trade deal is they're only do it if it's in their economic interest to do it. And the only two sectors where it would really be in their economic interest to do it are healthcare and agriculture. There's no way that the UK is going to put a deal together which would result in US firms running the NHS or charging British people when they get sick to get hold of healthcare, as in you present a credit card when you turn up at hospital. That's a non-starter. And their agricultural standards are very different from ours and Europe's. And of course, last time around we were discussing this. There's all the talk of chlorinated chicken and hormone-fed beef. Again, food that British people don't want to eat. So there are lots of barriers were lots of barriers in place even before Trump came in. Now Trump is in, of course, we've seen that his trade policy is uncertain and changes on a daily basis. I mean, even he yesterday, when he announced his tariffs on cars, had to say, I really mean it this time. This isn't a negotiating tactic. This is permanent. And we will have to wait and see how permanent it is. But it has been the case that he's announced tariffs and then unannounced tariffs and then put a period of time in before they're implemented and then implemented in the end. And indeed, there are now tariffs in place on the UK as well. So he isn't. It would be fair to say, evidencing that even he is interested in a trade deal with the UK. But the other perspective on this, of course, is just that the EU is a much, much bigger trade partner of the UK. And the OBR, the Office of Budget Responsibility, and many, many other economists have, looked at the evidence of what's happened to our economy since we left the EU and found that there's a permanent 4 to 5% hit of GDP, which is huge, obviously. Now, it isn't the case that you can get all of that 4 to 5% back in a trade deal, in a renewed trade deal with the EU or in the current reset negotiations that we're having. But the closer we get to Europe, the more we reduce the barriers that were put in place by Brexit, then the lower that 4 to 5% goes, which means that our economy does better, more jobs, higher wages, more productivity. So the bigger prize is sat there right on the other side of the English Channel, and it certainly isn't on the other side of the Atlantic. And it is the case, I believe, and Seamus will confirm, but it's the case, I believe, that all the trade deals that have been put in place since we left the European Union haven't made any difference to British GDP. I mean, I think we had new deals with Australia and New Zealand, and even the last government had to admit that the impact on GDP was to be 0.001%. I mean, basically nothing, So this is in part because the EU is a very, very big trading partner, pre-existing trading partner, but it's also because geography matters. Geography obviously matters when you're sending stuff back and forth. You want to send it somewhere close to minimize costs. You want to get stuff back. But it also matters in services trade as well. So things like law or financial services and more education and things like that. And that's partly because you want to be working in the same time zone, but it's also because you want to be dealing with people who are similar to you culturally and who understand your language and things like that. So the EU is a much, much better trading partner for us than the US.
Joe, your perspective on this, just briefly, if you would.
Well, I think the American comedian John Mulaney described it best when he talked about the political situation being like a horse in a hospital. It's very, very unpredictable, and it's difficult to know how things will change, as has been said, from day to day. That unpredictability is important. But also, I would say that generally speaking across the world, but particularly in America, there isn't really a strong public desire for trade deals. What we have seen repeatedly and from many sides of the political spectrum is the idea of protectionism, whether it's tariffs or other measures. That is the way that many economies are moving. And so while politicians may pay lip service to a trade deal, the reality is that you don't really make deals with blocs as large as the EU, China or America if you're as small as the UK. And so exactly how that plays out remains to be seen. But I imagine that a lot of it is just political rhetoric rather than actual action.
I'm going to try and fit in two more questions before 10 o'clock when we end this session. Seamus, I'm going to start with you in this one. Does the UK savings regime need to be examined? And how can we create a better investment culture in the UK? And how do we solve the pensions gap?
It's a very good question. I know that the government are looking and are talking about reforming the pension system to encourage pension providers to use more of that money to invest in economic growth. pension funds typically and quite sensibly and understandably tend to be conservative when it comes to using the money that they have, and they have a lot of money that can be used very productively. But understandably, their customers, the pensioners and the people who are making their pension savings with these funds, want to make sure that their money is well managed and looked after and is safe and secure. So balancing those considerations, I think, is a challenge when it comes to this question of reform. But there is potentially a very significant opportunity to divert some of that money into things like infrastructure, into things like business scale-ups and startups and scale-ups, and other aspects that I think would give a significant return on investment. But again, the challenge comes back to, we've had issues in the past where pension funds have gone awry and it's cost people quite a lot. And the impact on the vulnerable and the elderly is something that I think Labour will be very, very acutely aware of. Going back to the discussion earlier about the welfare cuts, this is a government that instinctively is comprised of people who want to look after the vulnerable, and making sure that they do that job effectively and well, given the challenging constraints that they face, I think will be a greater consideration. So we'll have to just wait and see, I think.
Siobhan McDonagh, you of course are on the Treasury Select Committee, and I want to ask you this question as well. Just a reminder of it: does the UK savings regime need to be examined, and how can we create a better investment culture in the UK? How do we solve the pensions gap? Siobhan.
Well, we know that with the Chancellor's growth agenda, looking at investment and looking at the pension funds is very central to her thoughts. Our discussions on the Treasury Select Committee are precisely the balance between ensuring that consumers are protected and the appetite for risk. We had the Financial Conduct Authority in on Tuesday just over that particular question, because the Chancellor has had all the regulators in and give them a secondary duty for whatever it is they have responsibility for, to look at promoting growth. And I know just from a local authorities pension point of view, there are mergers going on between the pension funds. We have the mad situation where at the moment London Council pension funds don't invest in building homes in London. They invest in building homes outside London, even though the acutest need is in London itself. So there will be a freeing up of that, and all the time at the back of your head is, how far does that go in order to ensure that people's they're not ripped off, that their money isn't taken by chancellors. But that is very central to what the Chancellor is looking at.
Just very briefly, about a minute each if possible, because I'm sure people have meetings at 10 o'clock. Mike and Joe. Start with Mike, then Joe, please.
On savings and investment.
Yes.
Yeah, I think this is a real priority for the government. We've already seen Rachel Reeves take action to bring together some of the local government pension funds so that they can invest more broadly, globally, and within the UK as well, as a way of increasing, making best use of that available finance, which is huge. And I don't know whether the question refers to personal savings as well, but I think that is also something the government is going to want to continue to encourage, particularly if they can, encouraging people to invest more in stocks and shares rather than keeping their money in cash. But clearly this is a problem, and it's a problem that has an impact on people's livelihoods as they're getting older, but it's also a problem that has an impact on GDP.
Okay, Mike, thank you, and thank you for your the concise nature of your answer. Joe, we've about a minute and a half left. Perhaps you give us a minute on this question: does the UK savings regime need to be examined, and how can we create a better investment culture in the UK, and how do we solve the pensions gap? You're on mute again, I'm afraid. I don't know why, Joe, you keep being put on mute. Maybe you could take yourself off. Thank you. There we go.
There we go. Sorry, a lot of it is outside the remit of public opinion, because these are economic complexities that escape most people, and indeed I would argue at times escape me as well. But what I would say is that investment is viewed as important, but the most important thing when it comes to public opinion on what the government should be doing is growing the economy and bringing down the cost of living. Those are the two most important things. Now, of course, a lot of these things feed into each other, but those are seen as the most important measures. And so if you achieve those, essentially, people don't mind so much how you do it. You just have to keep your eye on that.
Well, thank you to the whole panel today, Dame Siobhan McDonough, Mike Buckley, Seamus Nevin, and Joe Twyman. I appreciate all of your inputs, and thanks to everybody for sending in all the questions. Thank you to Atticus Partners for staging this event. I'm Peter Cardwell. If you want to hear more on the Spring Statement, you can hear it on my show on Talk tomorrow between 4 o'clock and 7 o'clock on the Drive Time programme. But thank you to everybody who has taken part. No doubt there'll be another one of these events very, very soon, looking at the big public policy issues in the UK. For the meantime, thank you to the panel. Thank you to those behind the scenes who have organised this event, and have a really good day, everybody. Thanks for your company.